James Harrington looked forward to peaceful mornings on his new porch. After 20 years as a Navy SEAL, he had earned this quiet life in the Oakwood Estates neighborhood. The small suburban community seemed perfect 3 months ago, when he bought the single-story brick home with the big backyard. The real estate agent had mentioned something about a homeowners association, but James hadn't worried much about it. He kept his lawn neat and his house in good shape. This particular Saturday started like any other. James woke up early, brewed his coffee, and settled into the comfortable chair on his front porch. The morning air felt crisp and birds chirped in the maple tree he had planted last month. He took a deep breath and smiled. This was exactly the peace he had dreamed about during those long deployments. The American flag on his newly installed flagpole fluttered gently in the breeze. James had put it up last weekend after filling out all the paperwork the HOA required. The form had sat on someone's desk for 2 weeks before he got approval, but he had followed the rules. The flag reminded him of the country he had served and the friends he had lost. It wasn't just decoration to him, it meant something real. He had just taken his second sip of coffee when a black SUV with Oakwood Estates HOA enforcement painted on the side pulled up to his curb. James raised an eyebrow. He hadn't seen these vehicles around the neighborhood before. 3 people climbed out, all wearing matching polo shirts with HOA badges. They marched up his walkway like they were on a mission. James noticed how they scanned his property, making notes on their tablets. The woman in front, whose badge read Director Patterson, had a tight expression on her face. "Morning," James called out politely. "Can I help you folks with something?" The 3 ignored his greeting completely. The director stepped forward and knocked hard on his front door, even though James sat right there on the porch, clearly visible. "Excuse me," James said, standing up. "I'm right here. Is there a problem?" Director Patterson turned, looking annoyed at the interruption. "Are you the homeowner?" "Yes, I am. James Harrington. I just moved in about 3 months. You're in violation of Oakwood Estates Code 23B, she cut him off, reading from her tablet. "Unauthorized structural additions to the property exterior." James set his coffee down. "If you mean the flagpole, I filled out all the paperwork. Got approval 2 weeks ago." He kept his voice calm and reasonable. "Our records show no such approval," said one of the men beside her. His badge read Officer Wilson. "I have a copy inside," James offered. "Give me a minute and I'll get it for you." "We need to inspect the violation," Director Patterson said, ignoring his offer. She turned back to the door and knocked again, harder this time. "HOA enforcement, open up." James felt his patience wearing thin. "I just told you I'm the homeowner and I'm standing right here. There's no need to pound on my door." The 3 officers exchanged glances. Then, without warning, they stepped around James and tried the door handle. Finding it unlocked, Director Patterson pushed it open. "Hey!" James moved quickly to block their entry. "You can't just walk into my home without permission. According to Section 5 of the covenant you signed, HOA enforcement has the right to inspect all violations," Officer Wilson recited, pulling out a small booklet. "That doesn't mean you can barge in without warning," James countered. "I have rights as a homeowner. You're in violation." Director Patterson's voice rose sharply. She tried to push past James, but he stood firm in his doorway. "Step back, please," he said, his voice dropping lower, steadier. It was the same voice he had used during tense operations, when keeping calm meant keeping people alive. Instead of backing down, Officer Wilson shoved against the door hard, catching James off guard. The door slammed into James, then bounced back and struck the wall with enough force to crack the drywall. The brass doorknob punched a hole in the plaster. "You're interfering with HOA business," the 3rd officer said, speaking for the first time. His name badge read Officer Taylor. He pulled out his phone. "I'm documenting this for the violation report." James took a deep breath. 20 years of military discipline helped him keep his composure. "You've just damaged my property," he said evenly. "I'm going to have to ask all of you to step back now." "The flagpole is coming down today," Director Patterson announced, ignoring the damaged wall. "The fine is $200 per day until compliance is met." "I have the approval form," James insisted. "Let me get it." "Too late for that," Officer Wilson said with a smirk. "Should have had it ready." The 3 officers pushed further into James's home, moving past him into the living room. James followed, growing increasingly concerned by their aggressive behavior. This wasn't just rude, it felt like an invasion. I'm telling you to stop right now, James said firmly. You have no right to be in my home like this. Director Patterson turned on him. Listen carefully, Mr. Harrington. We take rule violations very seriously in Oakwood Estates. Some people think they're special, think the rules don't apply to them, but nobody gets special treatment here. I'm not asking for special treatment, James replied. Just basic respect and proper procedure. Officer Taylor had wandered into the kitchen and was opening cabinets. James followed him. What exactly are you looking for in my kitchen cabinets? Additional violations, Taylor replied without looking up. James pulled out his phone and started recording. I'm documenting this entire interaction, he announced. I've asked you to leave my property and you've refused. You've damaged my door and wall and now you're searching through my private belongings without permission. The officers exchanged uncertain glances. This clearly wasn't the reaction they were used to getting. The flagpole needs to come down by Monday, Director Patterson said, her voice slightly less confident, and there will be fines for non-compliance and for obstructing our inspection. James nodded slowly, still recording. I understand you believe that. Now I'm asking you one more time to leave my property. I'll bring my approval paperwork to the HOA office on Monday morning, and we can sort this out properly. We're not finished here, Officer Wilson insisted, though he had stopped rummaging through James's belongings. Yes, James said firmly. You are. Something in his tone, perhaps the calm certainty of a man who had faced far worse situations, finally got through to them. Director Patterson gave a sharp nod to the others, and they reluctantly moved toward the door. Monday morning, 9 a.m., she said, and that flagpole better be down. After they left, James stood in his doorway for a long moment, watching the black SUV drive away. His peaceful Saturday morning was ruined, and now he had a damaged wall to repair. He looked up at his flag still waving in the breeze and then down at the cracked drywall and the hole punched by the doorknob. James took out his phone again and carefully photographed all the damage. Then he called the local police to file a report about the property damage and the unauthorized entry. The officer who took his call sounded sympathetic but not surprised. We've had other complaints about the Oakwood HOA enforcement team, the officer told him, but they usually back down when confronted. After hanging up, James sat back down on his porch, his coffee now cold. The peaceful neighborhood suddenly felt different. He thought about his friends still serving around the world, the oath they had all taken to protect people's rights and freedoms. It seemed ironic that here in his own home he was facing this kind of treatment. As he stared at his flagpole, James made a decision. This wasn't just about a piece of metal in his yard anymore. This was about standing up to bullies who used their little bit of power to push people around. He had spent his career protecting American values. He wasn't about to let these HOA officers trample on them now. James picked up his phone again. He scrolled through his contacts until he found Mike Johnson, his former team leader. They hadn't spoken in a few months, but that didn't matter. SEAL team members were family no matter how much time passed. The phone rang 3 times before Mike answered. Hey, brother, James said. Got a situation here I could use some advice on. As he described the morning's events to his old friend, James could feel his sense of purpose returning. He hadn't planned on fighting any battles in retirement, but some things were worth standing up for. By the time he hung up, he had the beginnings of a plan. The HOA officers had no idea who they were dealing with. James Harrington wasn't just any homeowner. He was someone who had been trained to assess threats, plan missions, and never back down when he was in the right. And he wasn't alone. Monday morning would come soon enough, and James would be ready. The rest of James's weekend wasn't exactly peaceful. After the HOA officers left, he spent hours fixing the damaged wall beside his door. The hole wasn't too bad, but the cracked drywall needed patching. As he worked, his mind kept returning to the morning's confrontation. What bothered him most wasn't the damage or even the threats about his flagpole. It was the way they had pushed into his home. The smug looks on their faces like they enjoyed having power over others. In his 20 years as a Navy SEAL, James had seen that look before, usually on the faces of people who misused whatever small authority they had. By Sunday evening, he had patched the wall and was touching up the paint when his phone rang. It was Mike Johnson, his former team leader. Hey James, been thinking about what you told me, Mike said without preamble. This HOA situation sounds like a real problem. It's handled, James replied, though he wasn't entirely convinced himself. I've got the approval papers ready for tomorrow. Yeah, but that's not the point, is it? Mike's voice had that thoughtful tone James remembered from mission planning sessions. If they're doing this to you, what are they doing to people who can't stand up for themselves? James set down his paintbrush. Mike was right, and he knew it. I've been thinking the same thing. You know what's funny? Mike continued. Tom, Andy, and Pete were just talking about getting together next weekend. We were planning to surprise you anyway. James smiled at the mention of his other teammates. You guys were coming to visit? 5 years since our last deployment together. Seemed like a good time for a reunion, Mike explained. But now I'm thinking maybe we can help with your HOA problem while we're there. I don't need backup for a neighborhood dispute, James protested, though part of him appreciated the offer. Not backup, Mike clarified. Just support. Plus, I'm curious to see these folks who think breaking down doors is part of managing a neighborhood. After they hung up, James sat on his porch looking at the flagpole that had started all this trouble. The flag moved gently in the evening breeze. He wasn't taking it down, that much he knew for sure. But he also knew that tomorrow's meeting at the HOA office needed to be handled carefully. Confrontation wouldn't solve anything. Monday morning arrived with gray clouds threatening rain. James put on a button-down shirt and khakis, not too formal but respectful. He gathered his approval documents, the photos of the damage, and the police report he'd filed. Before leaving, he made copies of everything. The Oakwood Estates HOA headquarters turned out to be a small office in a strip mall on the edge of the neighborhood. A sign on the door read, "Preserving Property Values Through Excellence." James arrived precisely at 9 a.m. Inside, a receptionist looked up from her computer. Can I help you? James Harrington. I have an appointment with Director Patterson regarding a property issue. The receptionist's smile faded slightly. Oh, yes. Please have a seat. She'll be with you shortly. James sat in one of the plastic chairs along the wall. The office was decorated with framed photos of perfect-looking houses and gardens. A poster listed top 10 covenant violations with warnings about the fines for each. 20 minutes passed before a door opened and Director Patterson emerged. She looked surprised to see James sitting patiently. Mr. Harrington, she said stiffly. Come in. Her office was small but neat with a large desk that took up most of the space. Officer Wilson was already inside, standing against the wall like a security guard. I understand you have some confusion about our visit on Saturday, Director Patterson began, not offering James a seat. James remained standing as well. No confusion. I have concerns about how your team conducted themselves, and I've brought my flagpole approval to clear up any misunderstanding. He placed the approval form on her desk. Director Patterson barely glanced at it. This form isn't properly authorized, she said dismissively, and regardless, the size and placement of your flagpole violates Section 23B of the Covenant. The approval specifically addresses the size and placement, James pointed out calmly. And it has the required signatures. Officer Wilson stepped forward. Director Patterson has final say on all approvals. That's in the bylaws, James nodded slowly. I understand. That's why I've also brought these. He placed the photos of his damaged wall on the desk, followed by a copy of the police report. I'd like to discuss the property damage caused by your team and the unauthorized entry into my home. Director Patterson's expression hardened. Our officers have the right to inspect properties for violations. If you interfered with their duties, that's a separate violation. According to the police, James replied evenly, forcing entry into a private home exceeds the authority granted to an HOA, regardless of what your covenant states. A tense silence filled the room. James could see Director Patterson considering her options. What exactly do you want, Mr. Harrington? She finally asked. 3 things, James said. First, I want written confirmation that my flagpole is approved and compliant. Second, I want reimbursement for the wall repair costs. And third, I want your assurance that your enforcement team will respect proper procedures in the future. Or what? Officer Wilson asked with a slight sneer. James turned to look at him directly. Or I'll file a formal complaint with the State Housing Authority and pursue legal action for trespassing and property damage. He spoke without anger or threat, just stating facts. Director Patterson leaned forward. Mr. Harrington, you're new to our community. Perhaps you don't understand how things work here. We maintain high standards, and that requires strict enforcement. I understand standards and enforcement, James replied. I also understand leadership and respect. During my time as a Navy SEAL, I learned that good leaders don't need to break down doors to be effective. The mention of his military background seemed to register with Director Patterson. She studied him with new interest. Navy SEAL. Well, thank you for your service, she said, her tone softening slightly. But that doesn't exempt you from our community standards. I'm not asking for exemptions, James clarified. Just fair treatment and proper procedures. After more discussion, they reached a partial agreement. Director Patterson reluctantly signed off on the flagpole approval, but refused to address the damage to his wall or to admit any wrongdoing by her team. We'll consider this matter closed, she said, clearly wanting him to leave. James gathered his papers. The flagpole issue is resolved, yes. The other matters we'll have to address another time. As he walked out of the office, James noticed a bulletin board with photos of violations throughout the neighborhood. Most seemed minor. A basketball hoop left out, a garbage can not brought in promptly, a garden gnome deemed unapproved decor. Next, to each photo was the amount fined. The receptionist was helping an elderly woman who looked upset. But I can't pay $300 this month, the woman was saying. My medication costs went up and I'm on a fixed income. Late fees are non-negotiable, Mrs. Chen, the receptionist replied. The board has been very patient, but if payment isn't received by Friday, we'll have to place a lien on your property. James slowed his pace. Listening, it's just the rose bushes, Mrs. Chen said quietly. They were my husband's. He planted them before he passed. Unapproved landscaping is a violation, the receptionist repeated mechanically. The fines accumulate until the violation is corrected. James approached them. Excuse me, he said to Mrs. Chen, I couldn't help overhearing. I'm pretty good with gardening. Maybe I could help you bring those rose bushes into compliance. The elderly woman looked up at him with surprise. That's very kind, but the HOA says they have to be removed completely. They're the wrong type for this neighborhood. James glanced at the receptionist, who looked uncomfortable. I see, he said. Well, I'm James Harrington. I live on Oak Street. If you'd like some help with your yard, I'm happy to lend a hand. Mrs. Chen introduced herself and thanked him. They exchanged phone numbers before James left the office, aware of the receptionist watching them carefully. On the drive home, James made several calls. First to Mike, updating him on the meeting, then to a lawyer friend who specialized in property law, finally to a few neighbors he had met since moving in. By the time he pulled into his driveway, James had learned some interesting things about Oakwood Estates HOA. The current board had been in power for 6 years. Complaints were common but rarely resulted in changes. The annual budget included a large allocation for enforcement activities, but very little for community improvements. James looked up at his flag, still flying above his home. This wasn't just about him anymore. Some battles were worth fighting, not for yourself, but for people who couldn't fight for themselves. Later that afternoon, James visited Mrs. Chen. Her rose bushes were beautiful, clearly well tended for many years. She explained how her late husband had brought them from their first home when they moved to Oakwood Estates 15 years ago. The rules changed 3 years ago, she explained sadly. Suddenly they weren't the approved variety anymore. As they talked, other neighbors stopped by. Each had their own story about the HOA, fines for children's toys left in yards, threats over paint colors that had been previously approved, selective enforcement depending on who you knew on the board. By the time James headed home, he had a much clearer picture of what was happening in Oakwood Estates, and he knew exactly what to tell Mike and the others when they arrived for their reunion on Friday. The battle with the HOA was just beginning. But for the first time in months, James felt the same sense of purpose that had driven him throughout his military career. Sometimes the most important fights were the ones right in your own backyard. By Friday afternoon, James had transformed his backyard into the perfect spot for a reunion. He set up a grill, arranged chairs around a fire pit, and stocked a cooler with drinks. He was looking forward to seeing his old teammates, but his mind kept drifting back to Mrs. Chen and the other neighbors he'd met throughout the week. Since Monday, James had spoken with 12 different families in Oakwood Estates. Each had their own story about the HOA, and none of them were good. An older gentleman named Frank had been fined for his grandson's chalk drawings on the sidewalk. A young couple had received warnings about their vegetable garden being visible from the street. A single mother had been threatened with legal action over a small business she ran from her home. Despite having all the proper permits from the city, the pattern was clear. The HOA targeted people who either couldn't fight back or didn't know their rights. And behind it all was Director Patterson, who seemed to enjoy wielding her power over others. James was setting out paper plates when he heard cars pulling into his driveway. He walked around to the front yard and broke into a wide smile. 4 men were climbing out of 2 vehicles, all grinning at him. "Look what the tide washed in," James called out. Mike Johnson, tall and lean with salt and pepper hair, reached him first and pulled him into a bear hug. "Good to see you, brother." Tom Williams, broad-shouldered and serious-faced, was next. "Nice place you got here, except for the nosy neighbors." Andy Parker, the youngest of the group with a mischievous smile, punched James lightly on the arm. "Retired life making you soft, old man?" Pete Ramirez, quiet and observant as always, simply nodded at James before saying, "We brought steaks." Within minutes, it felt like no time had passed since they'd last been together. The 5 men fell into the easy rhythm of friendship, forged through years of training and missions. They set up in the backyard, grilled the steaks, and shared stories about their lives since leaving active duty. It wasn't until they were finishing their meal that Mike brought up the reason for their visit. "So tell us more about this HOA situation," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Sounds like you've been busy investigating." James nodded. "It's worse than I initially thought. These people aren't just strict about rules. They're bullies who target the vulnerable." He told them everything he'd learned over the past week: the excessive fines, the selective enforcement, the threats against people like Mrs. Chen. As he spoke, he could see his former teammates' expressions growing more serious. "That doesn't sit right," Tom said when James finished. "People work hard for their homes. They shouldn't have to live in fear." Pete, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "What's the plan, James?" "You always have a plan." James smiled slightly. Pete knew him well. "I've been gathering information. Photos, testimonies, financial records, anything that shows a pattern of abuse. But I need help digging deeper." "Like a recon mission," Andy said with a grin. "Count me in." "More like an intelligence operation," James corrected. "We need to understand how deep this goes before deciding how to respond." Mike nodded approvingly. "Smart approach. What are we looking for specifically?" James pulled out a notebook where he'd been keeping track of everything. "First, I want to verify if the selective enforcement is as widespread as it seems. Second, we need to understand the financial side. Where do all these fines actually go? And third, I want to know who else is involved besides Director Patterson." They spent the next hour planning their approach. Each man would take on a different aspect of the investigation. Mike would look into the HOA's financial records, which were technically public but kept intentionally difficult to access. Tom would document examples of inconsistent rule enforcement throughout the neighborhood. Andy would talk to more residents to gather testimonies. Pete would research the legal boundaries of HOA authority, and James would continue building relationships with the affected neighbors. "Remember," James cautioned, "this isn't a military operation. We're just gathering information that the community has a right to know. Nothing illegal, nothing that crosses any lines." The others nodded in agreement. They understood boundaries. It was part of their training. "One week," Mike suggested. "We gather what we can, then decide next steps." The following morning, they put their plan into action. James introduced his friends to the neighborhood as fellow veterans visiting for a reunion. No one questioned their presence or their interest in the community. Tom walked the entire neighborhood with a camera, documenting houses with technical violations that hadn't been cited, many belonging to board members or their friends. He found basketball hoops identical to ones that had been fined, unapproved decorations that somehow escaped notice, and lawn ornaments that mysteriously weren't problems when they appeared in certain yards. Andy had a natural charm that put people at ease. He visited the community center, the local coffee shop, and even the dog park, striking up conversations with residents. Many were initially hesitant to talk about the HOA, but once they realized Andy was sympathetic, the stories poured out. He recorded them all with permission. Pete spent hours at the county records office and the local library, researching HOA law and the specific covenants of Oakwood Estates. He discovered that several of the board's practices were legally questionable, including entering homes without proper notice and imposing fines without an appeals process. Mike had the most challenging task. The HOA's financial records were theoretically available to all homeowners, but accessing them required jumping through numerous hoops. He persisted, using his military ID and a carefully worded request that hinted at legal consequences if denied. By Wednesday, he had copies of the budget, expenditure reports, and bank statements going back 3 years. James focused on building trust with the neighbors he'd already met. He helped Mrs. Chen bring her garden into compliance without removing her beloved rose bushes. He fixed Frank's fence that had been damaged during a storm but never repaired, because he was afraid of doing it wrong and getting fined. He advised the young couple about their rights regarding the vegetable garden. Each night, the 5 friends gathered at James's house to share what they'd learned. The picture that emerged was troubling. The HOA collected roughly $300,000 annually in dues and another $150,000 in fines, yet the community pool had been closed for repairs for 2 years. The playground equipment was rusty and unsafe. The promised community garden had never materialized. Meanwhile, the budget showed large expenditures for administrative costs and professional services with little detail. The 3 paid positions, director, Patterson, and the 2 enforcement officers, received substantial salaries plus performance bonuses tied to the amount of fines collected. Most concerning was what Tom discovered about the board itself. Of the 7 members, 4 owned rental properties in the neighborhood but didn't live there themselves. They appeared to use the HOA as a way to protect their investments while being completely disconnected from the impact on actual residents. This isn't just unfair, Pete said as they reviewed everything on Thursday night. Some of this might be illegal, especially the conflict of interest with absentee board members using their positions for financial gain. Mike nodded, studying the financial documents spread across James's dining table. And these numbers don't add up. There's money missing, or at least unaccounted for. James leaned back in his chair, taking it all in. So what do we do with this information? We can't just confront them without a plan. We could take it to the authorities, Tom suggested. The county has oversight of HOAs. That might work eventually, Pete replied, but bureaucracy moves slowly. Meanwhile, people like Mrs. Chen keep suffering. Andy, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. What if we go public? Share what we've found with the entire community at once? The 5 men looked at each other, considering the idea. The monthly HOA meeting is tomorrow night, James said slowly. Every homeowner has the right to attend. Mike smiled. The same smile James remembered from missions when a plan was coming together. Perfect timing for our findings, wouldn't you say? They spent the rest of the evening preparing. This wouldn't be a confrontation with threats or intimidation. They were long past those days. This would be a professional presentation of facts delivered calmly and backed by evidence. James called Mrs. Chen and a few other neighbors he'd come to know, encouraging them to attend the meeting. Word spread quickly. By Friday morning, it seemed like half the neighborhood was planning to be there. As evening approached, the 5 friends gathered one last time before heading to the community center, where the meeting would be held. They wore casual business clothes, no military gear or anything that might seem threatening. Remember, James said as they prepared to leave, we're not there to take over or cause trouble. We're there to empower the community with information they deserve to have. The others nodded. This mission wasn't about fighting an enemy. It was about standing up for people who needed allies. Just like old times, Mike said with a slight smile. Different battlefield, same principles. Together, they walked out to their cars, ready to face whatever came next at the Oakwood Estates HOA meeting. The community center was packed by the time James and his teammates arrived. People stood along the walls and in the back of the room, many looking surprised at the turnout. Normally, HOA meetings drew only a handful of residents, mostly the same faces each month. James spotted Mrs. Chen sitting near the front. She gave him a small wave and a nervous smile. He nodded reassuringly as he and his friends found spots against the wall where they could observe everything. At the front of the room, a long table was set up with 7 chairs. Director Patterson sat in the center, flanked by the other board members. She looked annoyed at the unexpected crowd. The 2 enforcement officers, Wilson and Taylor, stood near the door like security guards, arms crossed and expressions stern. Quite a turnout, Pete murmured, scanning the room with practiced eyes. People are tired of being pushed around, James replied quietly. They just needed to know they weren't alone. The meeting began promptly at 7 p.m. Director Patterson tapped her gavel and called for order, then launched into a reading of the previous meeting's minutes. Her voice was monotone, as if deliberately trying to bore everyone into leaving. Next came the treasurer's report, delivered by a thin man with glasses who spoke quickly about budgets and expenditures without providing any real detail. James noticed how he skimmed over specific numbers, using vague terms like maintenance allocations and administrative resources. Mike leaned close to James. Notice how he's not mentioning the $50,000 in consulting fees we found in the records? James nodded. The deception was obvious now that they knew what to look for. After the standard reports, Director Patterson moved to the open forum portion of the meeting, where residents could bring up concerns. This was typically limited to 5 minutes total. We have a larger crowd than usual tonight, she said with a tight smile, so we'll need to be brief. Does anyone have questions or concerns? Several hands shot up immediately. Director Patterson pointed to a woman in the second row. I'd like to know why we're still paying full pool maintenance fees when the pool has been closed. For 2 years, the woman asked. As we've explained before, the repairs are complex and ongoing. Director Patterson replied dismissively. Next question? An older man stood up without being called on. My grandson got a $100 fine for riding his bike on the sidewalk last week. Since when is that against the rules? Section 12(c) clearly prohibits recreational activities on common walkways. Officer Wilson called out from his position by the door. The rules are the rules. James watched as question after question was deflected or dismissed. The board members looked increasingly uncomfortable, but Director Patterson maintained her composure, treating each concern as an annoyance rather than a legitimate issue. Finally, Mrs. Chen raised her hand. To James's surprise, Director Patterson acknowledged her. Mrs. Chen, you have a question? The elderly woman stood slowly. Not a question. I want to tell everyone about my rose bushes. Her voice was quiet but clear. My husband planted them 15 years ago before he passed away. For 12 years they were fine. Then suddenly they were against the rules. The fines are now more than my monthly Social Security check. Director Patterson sighed loudly. Mrs. Chen, we've discussed your landscaping violations multiple times. I'm not finished, Mrs. Chen interrupted, her voice stronger now. This week, a new neighbor helped me understand that these rules are being applied unfairly. He showed me 3 houses on the board member's street with the exact same type of roses. No violations there. A murmur ran through the crowd. Director Patterson's face flushed. That's enough open forum for tonight, she announced, tapping her gavel. We need to move on to new business. Point of order, a voice called out. All heads turned to see Mike stepping forward. According to your own bylaws, the open forum must allow at least 15 minutes for community input. It's only been 6 minutes, Director Patterson stared at him. And you are? Mike Johnson, guest of homeowner James Harrington. Mike's voice was polite but firm. I've been reviewing your HOA documents, which are public record. The bylaws are quite clear about meeting procedures. A board member leaned over and whispered something to Director Patterson. She frowned but nodded reluctantly. Very well. We'll continue the open forum for 9 more minutes, but please keep comments brief and relevant. James decided it was time. He stepped forward. I'd like to address the board. Director Patterson's eyes narrowed when she recognized him. Mr. Harrington, what is your concern? Not just my concern, James replied. A concern shared by many here tonight. He moved to the front of the room, aware of all eyes on him. Over the past week, my friends and I have been talking with residents throughout Oakwood Estates. We've documented a pattern of selective rule enforcement, excessive fines, and questionable financial management. The room grew completely silent. Even the board members were watching him intently now. What gives you the right to investigate our community? Director Patterson demanded. As a homeowner, I have the right to understand how my dues are being spent, James answered calmly. And as community members, we all have the right to fair treatment. He gestured to his friends, who moved forward with folders of documents they'd prepared. We found significant discrepancies between the rules as written and how they're enforced, James continued. Tom Williams has documented 27 instances of identical violations being treated differently depending on who owns the property. Tom stepped forward and began distributing photos showing the inconsistencies. Board members' homes with basketball hoops and garden gnomes stood in stark contrast to the violation notices given to other residents for the same items. We've also reviewed the financial records, James said, nodding to Mike, who began handing out simplified spreadsheets. There are substantial unexplained expenses, and the community improvements promised in last year's budget were never completed. The treasurer sputtered. You can't just, these records are confidential. Actually, they're not, Pete interjected. State law requires HOA financial records to be available to all members. We've confirmed this with 3 separate property attorneys. The mood in the room was shifting. Residents were passing the documents among themselves, murmuring as they recognized their own experiences in the pattern being revealed. Furthermore, James continued, we've discovered that 4 of the 7 board members don't actually live in this community. They own rental properties here but have no personal stake in the neighborhood's well-being. This revelation caused an immediate uproar. People stood up shouting questions and expressing outrage. Director Patterson banged her gavel repeatedly, trying to regain control. This is outrageous, she shouted over the noise. These accusations are completely unfounded. They're all documented, Andy called out, holding up a thick folder. Names, dates, addresses, photographs, everything's here. And we've made copies for anyone who wants them. Officer Wilson started moving toward James, but stopped when he saw the 5 former SEALs standing together, calm but watchful. This wasn't going to be solved with intimidation. An older gentleman in the back stood up. James recognized him as Frank, whose fence he'd helped repair. I move that we call for an emergency election of new board members, Frank announced in a loud, clear voice. According to the bylaws, we can do that with a 2/3 vote of homeowners present at any official meeting. Director Patterson looked stunned. You can't just second the motion, called another resident. All in favor? Frank asked, looking around the room. Hands shot up throughout the crowd, far more than 2/3. This is completely irregular, Director Patterson protested, but her voice lacked conviction. She could see the tide turning against her. A woman James didn't recognize stood up from the 3rd row. I nominate Frank Thompson for board president. He's lived here for 20 years and knows this community better than anyone. More nominations followed quickly, all longtime residents known for their fairness and community involvement. Within minutes, a slate of new board candidates had been proposed, and a date was set for the official election the following week. As the meeting dissolved into excited conversation, Director Patterson and the other board members slipped out a side door. Officer Wilson approached James and his friends, who were helping distribute the remaining documents to interested residents. You think you've won something here? Wilson said quietly. But this isn't over. James met his gaze steadily. You're right about one thing. It's not over, because after the new board is elected, there will be a full audit of all HOA activities for the past 5 years, including any actions that might have crossed legal lines. Wilson's face paled slightly. Without another word, he turned and followed Director Patterson out the door. As the crowd began to disperse, residents came up to thank James and his teammates. Mrs. Chen hugged each of them, tears in her eyes. You've changed everything, she told James. For the first time in years, I'm not afraid to live in my own home. Later that night, the 5 friends gathered on James's porch. The neighborhood seemed different somehow, more peaceful but also more alive. Lights were on in houses up and down the street as neighbors called each other, sharing their reactions to the meeting. Not a bad mission, Mike said, leaning back in his chair. Different from what we're used to, but important in its own way. Tom nodded. Protecting people doesn't always mean what we thought it did. What happens next? Andy asked, looking at James. James watched a family walking their dog across the street, something he rarely saw before. The parents waved to him and he waved back. The community takes back control, he said simply. And we help if they need us, but this is their fight now. Pete smiled slightly. And your flagpole stays up. James laughed. Yeah, that too. He looked up at the flag still flying above his home. Sometimes the smallest things represent the biggest principles. As they sat together in comfortable silence, James realized that for the first time since leaving the service, he felt the sense of purpose he'd been missing. Different battlefield, same mission, standing up for those who needed someone on their side. The week following the HOA meeting was filled with more activity than Oakwood Estates had seen in years. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were now chatting in driveways, exchanging phone numbers and organizing for the upcoming election. The sense of community that had been suppressed under Director Patterson's regime was blossoming again. James and his teammates had planned to leave on Sunday, but they all agreed to stay until the election the following Thursday. There was still work to be done, and none of them wanted to leave the job unfinished. Just like the old days, Andy joked as they sat around James's dining table on Saturday morning. Mission extension. They had divided up new tasks. Mike was helping Frank and the other candidates prepare for their new roles, explaining the financial documents they'd uncovered. Tom was organizing a community cleanup day to tackle some of the maintenance issues the HOA had neglected. Pete was drafting revised bylaws that would prevent future abuse of power. Andy was creating a neighborhood communication system so residents could stay connected. James was in his element, coordinating it all while also keeping an eye out for any retaliation from Director Patterson and her team. They hadn't been seen since the meeting, but Officer Wilson's parting words still lingered in his mind. This wasn't over. Around noon, Mrs. Chen knocked on James's door holding a large tray of homemade dumplings. "For you and your friends," she said, smiling warmly. "A small thank you for what you've done." James invited her in, and soon other neighbors began stopping by as well. Frank brought his famous chili. The young couple with the vegetable garden brought fresh salad. By mid-afternoon, James's backyard had turned into an impromptu neighborhood gathering. "You know," Pete said quietly as they watched children playing tag on the lawn, "this is what we were really fighting for all those years. Not just abstract ideas of freedom, but moments like this. People living without fear." James nodded. He understood exactly what Pete meant. The peaceful afternoon was interrupted when Tom received a call from a resident who lived near the community center. Director Patterson and the other board members had been seen entering the building with several boxes. They appeared to be removing documents. "We need to stop them," Frank said immediately. "Those records belong to the community." "Let's not jump to conclusions," James cautioned. "We'll go check it out, but calmly. This isn't the time for confrontation." James, Mike, and Pete headed to the community center while the others stayed behind. When they arrived, they found Director Patterson's car and another vehicle parked outside. The community center door was propped open. Inside, they found Director Patterson and the treasurer hurriedly filling boxes with files from the office cabinets. They froze when they saw James and the others enter. "This is private HOA business," Director Patterson said stiffly. "You have no right to be here." "Actually," Mike replied, "these are community records that belong to all homeowners. Taking them off-site without authorization could be considered theft." The treasurer looked nervous. "We're just organizing things before the transition." "By removing financial records?" Pete asked, pointing to the labels on the files they were packing. "Including all the documents related to the special assessment fund that's missing $72,000? Director Patterson's face flushed. "You have no idea what you're talking about. Those funds were properly allocated for community improvements. Improvements that never happened," James pointed out, "like the pool repairs and the playground equipment." A tense silence filled the room. James could see Director Patterson calculating her options. He kept his voice calm and reasonable. "Look, no one wants this to end badly. Why don't we all take a step back, leave the documents here, and let the new board sort everything out properly?" For a moment it seemed like Director Patterson might argue, but then her shoulders slumped slightly. "Fine, take them. It doesn't matter anyway." She grabbed her purse and headed for the door, but paused to look back at James. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Swooping in to save everyone?" James shook his head. "No, I'm just a neighbor who believes people deserve to be treated with respect." After Director Patterson and the treasurer left, James, Mike, and Pete secured the files and called Frank to let him know what had happened. They decided to post volunteers at the community center around the clock until the election, just to be safe. As they walked back to James's house, Mike asked, "Do you think they'll face consequences for the missing funds?" "That will be up to the new board," James replied. "And the community. Some might want to pursue legal action. Others might just want to move forward." "What would you recommend?" Pete asked. James thought about it. "Transparency. Full disclosure about what happened, return of any misused funds, and then clear rules to prevent it from happening again." Punishment isn't always the best way to heal a community. The next few days were busy with preparations for the election. James was surprised when several people asked him to run for the board, but he declined. "I'm still new here," he explained. "This community needs leaders who have been here longer and understand its history." The day before the election, James's teammates gathered their things, preparing to leave the next morning. "You sure you don't want us to stay for the vote?" Andy asked. James shook his head. "You've all done more than enough. Besides, I think it's important that the community feels like they did this themselves." That night, they had a quiet dinner together, reflecting on the past week. "Not the reunion we planned," Tom said with a laugh, "but definitely memorable. Better than some of our other missions," Mike added. "No one got shot at, for one thing." They raised their glasses in a toast, not just to their friendship, but to what they'd accomplished together. Thursday's election saw the highest turnout in Oakwood Estates history. Over 90% of homeowners came to vote, standing in a line that wrapped around the community center. The atmosphere was festive, with people bringing food to share and children playing on the lawn outside. The results were decisive. Frank was elected board president by a landslide, along with 6 other longtime residents known for their fairness and commitment to the community. Director Patterson and her allies received less than a dozen votes each. After the results were announced, Frank asked James to come to the front of the room. "We want to thank James Harrington and his friends for helping us take back our community," Frank said to applause. "They showed us that standing together makes us stronger than we ever could be alone." James felt slightly uncomfortable with the attention, but appreciated the sentiment. "The real thanks goes to all of you," he said. "You had the courage to speak up and make changes. I just helped point out what was already wrong." As the meeting wrapped up, the new board announced their first initiatives: a complete audit of HOA finances, revised bylaws to be approved by all homeowners, and a community day to tackle the backlog of maintenance projects. Walking home afterward, James felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The neighborhood already felt different, friendlier, more open. People waved to each other and stopped to chat. Children played in front yards without parents nervously checking for HOA enforcement vehicles. When he reached his house, James paused to look up at his flagpole, the simple thing that had started it all. The flag moved gently in the evening breeze, a reminder that sometimes the most important battles were fought not on distant shores, but right at home. Over the next few months, Oakwood Estates transformed. The audit revealed years of financial mismanagement, and while some funds couldn't be recovered, the new transparency prevented further abuse. The community pool reopened in time for summer. The playground got new equipment. Mrs. Chen's rose bushes became part of a new community garden that residents tended together. Director Patterson and the former board members eventually agreed to repay some of the misused funds rather than face potential legal action. They sold their rental properties and moved away, but few residents missed them. James found himself more involved in the community than he'd expected to be. He didn't join the board, but he did help with projects around the neighborhood and became a familiar face at community events. He started a veterans group that met weekly, providing support and camaraderie for former service members living in the area. His former teammates visited again 6 months later, a proper reunion this time, with no HOA drama to handle. They remarked on the changes in the neighborhood and in James himself. "You seem settled here," Mike observed as they sat on the porch one evening. "Found your place," James nodded. "I have. Turns out I needed a mission, even in retirement. Just took a while to find the right one." "Defending the homeland," Tom said with a smile. "Literally." Later, after his friends had gone to bed, James sat alone on the porch looking up at the stars. He thought about the strange path that had led him here, from Navy SEAL to neighborhood advocate. Different worlds, but with the same core purpose: protecting people's rights and dignity. The flag above his,